You are listening to Insights from the Conference Board.
Hello everyone, my name's Sarah Bond and I'm the Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Council here at Conference Board Europe. The Council brings together diversity and inclusion executives from companies headquartered in Europe to share experiences, challenges and solutions in progressing diversity and inclusion at work. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all to this edition of Insights from Conference Board. Insights is a podcast series which helps talent executives address challenges and stay informed about current issues across the entire spectrum of human capital. Today's podcast marks International Women's Day 2020. The theme of International Women's Day this year is Each for Equal, with the focus on how each of us is contributing to forging a more gender equal world. Today I'll be in conversation with my guest Melanie Richards to talk about her own experience as a woman in business, about the path she's forged, and about her work and views in creating a more gender equal and inclusive workplace. By way of introduction, Melanie is partner and deputy chair of professional services firm KPMG UK. She joined KPMG in 2000 to develop its debt advisory practice and has more than 30 years' experience in bank lending, debt restructuring and capital markets instruments. She's an active campaigner inside and outside KPMG for workplace inclusion. She's a founding member of the 30% Club focused on increasing women's representation in FTSE boards and leadership. And she sits on the steering committee of the Hampton Alexander Review. Amongst other recognition, in the Queen's Birthday Honours list for 2019, Melanie was awarded a CBE for her services to business and inclusion. Welcome, Melanie. It's really fabulous to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm happy to be here.
So, listen, I wanted to start off, Melanie, by asking you a bit about yourself and about your own journey as a woman in business, about the role that you are doing at the moment, so in your position at KPMG, and about the path that you took to get there. I know that people listening to this podcast will be really interested to hear about you, first of all.
Well, thanks for that. You covered a little bit of me in your very kind introduction. But I guess my career has kind of been split into two. The first was I spent about half of my career, and it's now about 38 years I've been working in banking, and then the other half here at KPMG. And I kind of took a slightly strange route, really, in the sense that many people are often quite surprised to find that I'm not a graduate. I made a bit of a momentous decision to join banking as a school leaver, and it's a much longer story, but it started in a pub. I essentially met two guys, and one was doing sort of school leaver recruitment, and one was doing recruitment for me, for people who are graduates. And in the end, I concluded that I wanted to get on and was fiercely independent at that time and sort of got into the world of work. And I've continued to be, I guess, fiercely independent on one level, in the sense that I've always gone looking for things and joined banking, did a whole variety of things. And then when I moved to another bank, it was because I'd been approached partly, but also because I wanted to try something slightly different. And that's been sort of part of my story as well. And then I joined KPMG about 19 years ago, and as you said, to set up a business. But a big part of what I've been doing here and outside of the firm has also included inclusion. And I think you asked me sort of what's helped me. I think curiosity's helped me a great deal. So the fact that I've always, it's not sort of restlessness, but it's been taking an interest in what not necessarily I'm meant to be doing, and going and looking for new things to do. And that doesn't mean that there hasn't sometimes been pull as much as push, but I do think curiosity, particularly now, is pretty critical.
So that sounds like sort of constantly looking for answers to questions, or constantly asking questions yourself. Or when you talk about curiosity, where did that lead you in your career, Mel?
Yeah, so I think it's probably been in part when I think about. I guess I've looked around me to see what other people are already doing, but also thought about where things might go, and thought about where that might take my career. So, actually, probably saying it was where it would take my career. It's been more about how can I help other people has been actually at the heart of how I feel about work and how I feel about life, really. So whether it's meeting new people or looking for opportunity for either the organisation I'm working with or on a particular issue, it's been around how can we collaborate, how can we make a better answer out of having more people involved. And I guess I've involved myself in things in that way.
So, I mean, you just talked about your intention around helping other people and how that's driven you in your career. Can I ask, have you had role models and mentors throughout your career, Melanie? And in what ways did they help you?
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because often I get asked, did you have a role model? And I'm really pleased that you said, do you have role models? Because I think the reality is that at different stages in your life and for different things, you need different things. And so I've been very, very blessed that I have a whole range of people who I've either historically turned to or I continue to turn to, and they fulfill different parts of me. So, for example, as it happens, when I was going through having my children, and I've got 2 boys, I had sort of 2 people that I lent on quite heavily, apart from my good old mum. I think we've all, if one's lucky enough to have a mum, they're always part of this particular piece. But I have a very close girlfriend who's known me since I was 6. Our lives have taken completely different directions. She didn't stay in the world of work, and she stayed as a full-time mum and does a fantastic job at it. And I chose, obviously, to pursue a career. And yet, she's as different as our lives are. She provides me with huge amounts of input and insight, and continues to, but particularly around that time. And I had another girlfriend who was particularly, going through everything at the same time, but slightly ahead of me, who was enormously helpful. And of course, there are those people who probably take the form of more sponsors than mentors, people who identified and maybe saw something in me and gave me opportunities to do the things I've been happily allowed to do.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear about the value of friendships and how that's helped you, Melanie. I was just reading this morning, actually. I mean, we know this to be true, right, about the psychological benefits of female friendships. And on International Women's Day, I think great to be celebrating and marking that, as well as those more sort of formal mentoring and sponsorship arrangements that we might have. What, just looking at the other side of the coin, so if, friends and mentors and sponsors and your own sense of curiosity and determination helped you move forward, can I ask what's been the biggest challenge that you've faced as a woman in business over the years of your career, Melanie?
It's interesting because I think sometimes you look back when you've been working for quite as long as I have, with a little bit of rose-tinted spectacles, and when I get asked this question, I think, oh well, it hasn't been all too bad, and I haven't had too hard a time, and I've been very blessed and very fortunate. So I have to think, really, I have to kind of dig deep and think about this. And actually, if I'm honest, I think you can't see me, but you and I know each other, Sarah, but your listeners can't. But I'm an extremely small person physically, so I'm really, really quite short, and which is why you always see me in 3-inch heels. But by choice, by the way, because I love a heel, but not because anyone's making me. And it's an interesting question, because I did find it quite difficult early on to be a presence and to be, I hate that word, impactful. But I think making myself seen and heard was probably a big challenge. And if anyone's listening to this who knows me well, they'll think, I can't imagine she ever had trouble being seen or being heard, because I've kind of found ways of managing that for myself. But it's quite interesting, because when I look back in, particularly in the early days and early parts of my career, we talk about invisible women. I definitely could have fallen into that category if I hadn't been quite mindful about what I was doing.
And so is that about being a woman, or is that about, were you saying that's in relation to your height, Melanie? I mean, what was
I think it's probably both, right?
Yeah.
So in truth, and I'm happily, I mean, I know that that it's not necessarily over yet, and we'll probably get on to that, but happily there are more women in rooms that I go into. Not always, but there are more women around in relatively senior positions, and certainly across organisations. When I first started, one has to remember that there were times when I was, and there still are, when I was the only woman in the room. And so I suppose it was both of those things coming together, which was, I wasn't the biggest person and I was often the only woman. But I think you can learn to use that also to your advantage, which is around, and by the way, this isn't a shout out for being the only woman in the room. That kind of fills me with horror if anyone thought that's what I meant. But I think you can make yourself memorable. And so sometimes it was an advantage to be, but you can't just be remembered for being a woman. You also have to be remembered for having a more impact than just being defined by your gender.
Yeah. And how, in terms of your own impact, what were you particularly paying attention to? What did you particularly want to be remembered for or noted for as you were making your way through the world of work?
Well, my main role has always been to advise clients. I mean, that's the nature of the work that I do. And even when I was in banking, I was effectively advising people on what course they should take. And I think it's sort of, for me, it's about, am I remembered for not just the quality of the advice I give, but how I give the advice. And so, I see this as a kind of quite important feature of leadership, actually, which is to that capacity to put yourself in the shoes of the person receiving the advice. And so often we talk about, how we can be more inclusive in a context of, I don't know, HR, or seeing it as some sort of side thing. And actually, for me, it's about, I think I have over time become a better advisor, I'd like to think, which is sort of what my core day job was and continues to be, by thinking about things much more from the perspective of the other, rather than just seeing it through my own lens. So if there was one thing, I mean, even before I suppose I was really aware of inclusion being a thing, and which I started from a place of how can I be a better advisor and how can I make people feel that I both care and understand their perspective. And it's a really strange thing, because I live in, my world is, when I'm giving advice, certainly, or was particularly when I was doing debt advice, I think not many people would think of the word care necessarily as kind of an important feature of what you do. But I absolutely think caring about individuals and caring about the quality of what you do is central to being really good at what you do.
That's so interesting, and such strong links there with the work that you then went on to do alongside your client-facing work around diversity and inclusion in KPMG. As you said, we've known each other for several years, since back when I was head of diversity and inclusion for KPMG, and I remember you being such a champion and advocate on diversity and inclusion, and also a brave experimenter as well. There were some experiments that you and I tried, which were enjoyable and really challenging, I think, for both of us. I wanted to kind of move on to that part of your career, Melanie, and ask you a bit about your role in creating a more gender equal workplace inside KPMG, and of course outside, because you've done a huge amount of work, not just within KPMG, but as I was saying in the introduction, across the sectors. And I'm really interested in the path that you took to get there. So from being client facing, from having a very successful client facing career, what was it then that took you to be spending a lot more of your time working on issues around diversity and inclusion?
Well, it's interesting because I always felt, particularly when we first met, that I was sort of coming to the party a bit late. But, that was, I can't remember how many years ago, Sarah, that we were
15
together.
15 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and so, I think I was sort of just getting going when you and I met. So probably about 18 years ago, I started to notice things. And I think there were two reasons, really. So one of the things I think I mentioned earlier, that I've sort of seen the world through slightly rose-tinted spectacles sometimes. And if I said to you that I don't think I've always felt included, I think it's all on a relative basis. So of course there have been moments where I haven't been, but as a general sort of proposition, in those first 18, 19 years of my career, 20 years, I'd felt quite included. And it was only, I think, two things that really woke me up to the need to be more thoughtful and mindful about things. Was first, I think I started to notice that people weren't being included, and that wasn't a function of the organisation I was in. I think it was just a more general sense that I got both inside and outside, and started to be more alive to the, if you like, challenges of women progressing, particularly into senior roles, which really probably kicked it off. And then the second thing was that I was taking, a leadership role. It wasn't as, formal as I wasn't leading and running the entire business. Look, let's not overstate it. But I think when you become a partner in a firm like mine, it awakens you to, the scale of your responsibility and what this firm might look like in X number of years. And as I say, also alongside the things that were, or weren't, I should say, happening externally, and becoming much more alive to it. So it's sort of a slightly interesting route, because quite often, people talk about very personal experiences, and I could cite those, but actually thinking about this in the context of leadership and what it might mean and what it might need me to do.
Yeah, that is really interesting, isn't it? And I'm wondering, as a leader, what it is that you're most proud of having achieved over the years in which you've been working in this area. You talked about recognizing some of the barriers that women were facing to progression in the firm, and indeed more generally. And is it work in that area that you're most proud of, or what would you pinpoint as saying your as your greatest achievements here?
Oh, so the first thing I'd say, and I need to get this out there, is I hate talking about this as my personal achievements, because much as I've been, a recipient of, a number of awards and things, I always want to make it clear that these things only happen because of collaborative effort, and the idea that one person is making these things happen is flawed thinking. So a big shout out to all of the amazing people, including you, might I add, who have been part of, if you like, a longish journey in terms of trying to help improve things, as you say, both within and outside of the firm, and there are too many to name, frankly. I do think that the work that's been done, and let me tell you, I don't think it's done yet at all, around that I've done with many others around the 30% Club, the Hampton Alexander Review, and that's been huge collaborative effort, and I feel very proud and privileged to have been part of it. And of course, we hit 33% women on boards. And if you whilst I might be frustrated about the pace, as I suspect we always will be, if you told me that we would be having that conversation, 10 years ago, then it felt like a very, very distant possibility. So,
yes.
And now the work that I see going on in the Hampton Alexander Review, and with many other organisations, and indeed the businesses themselves, where there's much more mindful discussion about the progression of women into senior positions, I think we need to keep holding ourselves to account and moving away less from the talk and more into the action. And I share probably others' frustration, but I think we are getting more to the root of why things aren't moving and some of the big societal challenges that also exist out there. But it's not just on gender. I mean, I think I think the conversation is maturing. I think we're talking less about diversity and more about inclusion. And for me, if gender is just but one strand of this. And then the other aspect would be social mobility, which I think still remains a huge issue in this country, and on which my firm and others are doing some great work to try and bridge the gap and collaborate with government and other stakeholders to make a difference on.
Yeah. So just tell me a bit about societal challenges. You just used that phrase, and I'm wondering what are you thinking about when you're talking? What do you see as the biggest challenges, more broadly, that talk to diversity and inclusion and that need to be addressed?
Well, I think that, and this isn't to make excuses for businesses or for governments, but the truth is that some of the things that we're trying to unpack and, for want of a better, undo are as a result of what have been regarded as societal norms for such a long period of time. And, that starts very much earlier than when somebody joins my firm or any other firm. And so there's a sort of combination of course, and frankly, this isn't, as I say, an excuse. There are interventions that we as businesses, we as individuals have to take responsibility for. But I think it's getting down to that level of individual responsibility a lot earlier, because quite a lot of people's ideas and frames of reference are set so early. And I was very struck over the weekend, and if you haven't seen it yet, there's a great programme on Sky, which I think it is purely on Sky, called This Changes Everything. And it's about the work that Gina Davis has been doing, for example, in the movie industry, and trying to get more female directors, getting to much better data. And essentially, and it neatly demonstrates the point I'm trying to make, which is the shadow that's cast across how we operate and what we do in every fabric of life, whether it's work, whether it's in our social lives, etc. Starts very, very early with a whole bunch of different influences. And so I'm now taking us to this macro level, and it may sound like a kind of truly insurmountable issue, question, if we think that that's the scale of the challenge we have. But I do think we need to be reminded of that, which means that we're going to have to make much more collaborative, systemic efforts across a whole range of activity that isn't just inside business, but covers everything from the education system right the way through to how we individually parent and how we bring our children up. And of course, the exciting thing is that the more we have these conversations and the more people start to internalize it, the better shadows will all be casting around society, and hopefully we can see that difference happening. But of course, that's a slightly altruistic painting of the picture, I suppose.
I mean, I really, so at a sort of personal level, I'm really excited by the idea of seeing this as a systemic issue. I think it does offer much more potential than seeing it as the responsibility of particular groups, or business, or as government, or women, or men, or recognizing the connections and interconnections between them. And I'm still wondering, what's the biggest challenge that you think business itself faces in creating a more gender equal workforce, Mel?
Well, we often talk about the need for leadership, and I completely agree with that. If you haven't got people at the very top of an organisation, both singing from the same hymn sheet, but more importantly, singing authentically, to actually believing what it is that they are striving for, that has huge impact and power. But what we also know, and this is the bit that gets more challenging, is that however authentic a leader is, people's lived experiences inside the workplace are a function of the kind of micro behaviours that they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis, which are a function of how we all behave. So again, this isn't to diminish the significance of the leader in the middle of all of this, but the one thing that I've learned is that it is the hard yards that one does in terms of ensuring that everybody's lived experience is the same, similar, or that if it isn't, there are ways and means of dealing with making it better. I think that's the issue, and I think therefore, getting everybody on side and making everyone, that sounds rather forced, but getting people to believe the importance of inclusion is part of the daily life that they're leading, not some sort of sideshow, I think remains the single biggest challenge.
Yes. Yeah. And do you think, in what ways do you think that the approach to gender equality has changed in light of things like Me Too or other sort of movements for change that maybe started outside the world of business? Do you see an impact there in terms of how organisations are approaching change?
Well, it's interesting. We started to sort of talk about systemic change.
Yeah.
And I think if I look back on the very, very, very early days of kind of whether you want to call it the women's movement or the work that was being done, I think there was a time when women were the problem, and that people approached it as let's fix the women, let's not focusing on fixing systems.
Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest change I've seen, which is, by the way, I still think it's okay to help women in specific ways developmentally, but I think that the more mature organisations, and indeed, if you look at it from a sort of societal perspective, we are starting, and I think, Me Too has been part of that, we're starting to see much more focus on what is wrong with the system rather than what used to be, I think, sometimes, why aren't women achieving what they should be, or why aren't women achieving, period.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. That sort of fix the women idea seems to have thankfully taken a bit more of a backseat than it did do. Go on, Mel.
Yeah, but
sorry.
I don't think the game. Yeah, no, sorry. I don't think the game's over on that, though. In the sense that that's what I think it's helping happen. But I don't think we should underestimate that there are still some who think that women, we still haven't managed to sort out what a good stereotype of leadership should look like. We have stereotypes of leadership which do remain still quite male. I hate to genderize these things, but certainly I do think we've got more work to be done. Maybe that's the better way of framing it, on what we think good leadership looks like in the round, and taking the best from all people rather than taking a singular type of version of that truth.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Just a final question then, I suppose, to you, Melanie, is about what reflections would you like to end with that you might want to share with anybody else in a senior position? So you're just talking about leaders. To anybody else in a senior position about how they could best contribute to forging a more gender equal world for the future? Just looking back on your experiences, Mel, what would you suggest to other leaders?
So if I talk about it, inequality in general terms, but and I think it applies equally from a gender equality perspective, which is the most important learning for me has been when I have started to understand it from the perspective of somebody else that isn't me. And I don't think we can underestimate, there are lots of assumptions we make in our everyday working lives, and I think the power of seeing it from somebody else's perspective and understanding what their lived experiences is a kind of huge change agent. The second thing is that all too often I get asked, well, what's the one thing you would do? And the answer is there is no one thing. So, the idea and to the reality that this is and will continue to be hard yards and is going to require persistence, resilience, I guess the sort of standing up and understanding that you're not always going to take all people with you all of the time, and that requires, like, as I say, a level of resilience, and not being discouraged when you get it wrong. You talked at the top of this about our early attempts at things, and but also, more importantly, understanding that not everything will work. We have a lot more tested routes by which things can be done, but every individual organisation has a different, can have slightly different issues. So I think getting under the skin of it, and in some respects, not being frightened of getting it wrong in an effort to get it right.
Mel, thank you so much indeed for your time today, and for your reflections. I hear your experience and your knowledge and your insight about this as used in every response that you give, and I'm sure that listeners will do as well. And it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. And thank you to all of our listeners. If you've enjoyed today's conversation with Melanie Richards, please subscribe to the Conference Board's Insights podcast series, or you can explore the entire back catalogue, actually, of Conference Board's podcasts via our website, which is www.tcb.org/podcasts. Thank you once again, Melanie. I really appreciated it. And goodbye to everybody listening. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Insights from the Conference Board.